Rear crankshaft oil seal. Rear main oil seal. Doesn't appear to be leaking. Yeah. So I'll replace it since we've got a new one. And the instructions that come with the seal just say that it slides on to the back of the crank. They also say don't oil it. And it comes with a nice plastic installation sleeve that fits neatly there. So I guess what we do is we pull that one out and drive this one in. Right. Yeah, screwed in. Out she comes. Yeah, as advertised. Right. Apparently you can unbolt this housing here and take it off to take the seal off. Some people do, some people don't. I didn't. I replaced the seal in situ. The new seal came on this handy installing plastic thing, which I'm definitely keeping for later use. It just sits on the end of the crankshaft like that. Get a socket or something like this and just tap it with a hammer all round repeatedly to drive the seal into its housing. Quite easy to do. And there's the seal installed. I used a bit of gasket glue around the outer edge to make sure it did seal. Well, probably not necessary. The spigot bearing there feels fine, perfectly smooth. So although I got a new one, I'm not going to hike this one out and replace it. This one feels okay to me. I'll just apply a little, I think it's sealed, but I'll just apply a tiny bit of grease in there, just for luck. And I'll reuse that one. One thing the clutch kit didn't come with was a clutch centering tool. This is the one from my Mazda. Won't quite fit. However, this is the one from my Ford Escort. I know it looks like an input shaft with a couple of gear teeth missing, but it's what I use for centering the clutch on my Escort. That is a perfect fit in the spigot bearing. That is about 1 millimetre loose, but close enough. I might just wrap a layer of tape around there to bring it up to be a snug fit in the centre of the clutch, which is a dodge I learned from the internet. There we are. Quite a snug fit now, and certainly good enough to align the driven plate when I put it back in the car. Well, I guess this is literally shade tree mechanicking. Just going to give the bell housing a quick squirt. Get the worst of the gunk out of it, not that it really matters. Never gets on the clutch anyway. Clutch release bearing comes off. Feels alright, but we've got a new one anyway. And this comes out from its clip. Some sort of fancy spring clip there. Oh yeah. Like that. And there is a plastic clip. And it is a bit worn on the end. But we're replacing that with a new brass one anyway. So here's our new brass one. Just drive the old one out from behind. There we are. Slightly mangled end on it. The new brass one should just tap in. Yeah, that's in. Not going anywhere anyway. And that's all we're doing to the gearbox. A couple of other minor things on the gearbox. The gearbox input shaft sleeve there wants to be clean so the clutch release bearing can slide on it freely. Just cleaned it up with a bit of degreaser. This dowel which locates the starter motor gone a bit rusty, which is why I had to drive the starter motor off. So I just cleaned that up, cleaned off the rust with a bit of fine sandpaper, and then to make sure it stays clean, just brush on some anti-rust, preservative, whatever, just something to make sure it doesn't go rusty again. Anti-seize will probably do it. Right, flywheel. I'm going to use Loctite on the bolt threads, medium strength. I don't want the high strength. I don't want to have to use a gas axe to heat the thing if I ever want to get it apart again. Okay. Right, engine back plate. And now the flywheel. Gonna have to use both hands for this. Now flywheel on. I'll put in a couple of bolts finger tight just to hold it. Right, got to lock the flywheel before I can torque up the bolts. This bar that I used to undo the old flywheel doesn't fit quite so well on this one. So I'll see if the flywheel, the ring gear locker that I made for a BMW A series decades ago, will actually work on this. That's my flywheel locking gadget. I made it for a BMW A series decades ago. It works okay on my Ford Escort too. That end goes through one of the engine to gearbox mounting holes, and that end just drops down behind one of the teeth on the ring gear and locks it. Okay. Yeah, I just done £89 foot on the wall. Felt like £89 foot, so I guess the torque wrench works. And my flywheel locking device worked. Just checking the depth of the holes in the flywheel for the clutch bolts and reusing the old clutch bolts since they only take £18 foot torque. I actually shortened the old clutch bolts by 1 millimetre or so to about 15 millimetres. Right, so you hoist the clutch up into place, the driven plate inside, stuck in a couple of bolts to hold it loosely. That will centre the driven plate. Yeah, that's fairly well centred. Now we can do up all the bolts on the pressure plate. Okay, just torquing up the bolts on the clutch, £18 foot. I don't have a torque wrench that reads that low, but just £22 on the end of a 10-inch bar, works out at £18 foot. Gotcha. Gearbox weighs 31 kilos, 68 pounds. That's only 2 kilos more than the exhaust. Now, clutch splines should have a little bit of grease on them. You can get spline grease by using high temperature wheel bearing grease. Anything so long as it doesn't melt and splatter around on the clutch. So I'm going to wipe the surplus off. Use the clutch plate to spread it on the splines. This is the old clutch plate. I should really have done it with the new clutch plate just to confirm that it fits. But that's on the car right now. Wipe off surplus. The release bearing comes self-lubricated and it just slides on the sleeve there, so we don't grease that. do grease is the release lever, where it sits there, that end, and the other end where the clutch push rod pushes into it. So a good smear of grease in there and a good smear of grease in there. Again, wheel bearing grease is what I'm using. Any grease that will stay put and not dribble out too easily should do, I think. So there we are under the clip, that end. This carrier's all plastic, don't know if it likes grease, but I'll risk it. I'll give a dab just there and there, the contact points. Like that. Right, time to refit the gearbox. The engine back plate is in place and it locates on a dowel there and up there. I do not want it coming loose and dropping down, getting in the way when I'm putting the gearbox back on. So I've got a couple of plastic zip ties on it which I'll cut off and pull out as soon as the gearbox is almost fully bolted up. Also the trolley jack under the sump, again to stop the weight of the gearbox pulling the back of the motor down when I'm fitting it, and thereby crushing stuff between the back of the engine and the firewall. So it is now balanced on the plank. Okay, almost high enough to get the jack under. Oops. Well, there's a lot of waggling and pushing and fiddling around, pushing again. It's in. Okay, so it's finally in. So we'll whack in a couple of the really big long bolts to make sure of it. Using a super long extension again. Just got to cut off my plastic tie and take it out. Yeah. Okay, that's the two biggest bolts in. It should be enough to hold things back in the carrier bolts. The back of the gearbox. Got those carrier bolts in, so now I can take the jack away. Now we do the two shorter engine top bolts. So a long extension. Which I think I'll need a universal on the end. I forgot to video the next bit, but after the two main engine to gearbox bolts and the two top bolts, there comes the two starter bolts, starter motors there, the three smaller bolts into the sump, and the one small bolt from the front into the engine gear back plate. Right, gear change levers. One first. This pin goes in with a bit of grease on it. Yeah, there we are. So then that goes up and flops down at the front. Flush. Now the gear change lever goes in there and there with a bit of grease on it. Okay, so I go through like that. Plastic washer and clip on each end. Now the reversing light connector up here. Now the clutch slave cylinder. Now I was just going to refit the existing cylinder, slave cylinder, possibly with a longer push rod, but this one is actually leaking, so as we've got a new one, we will fit the new one. I'll take this one off first and let this thing bleed itself or whatever it does. when I fit it, it comes up snug at, oops, there we go. I think a little bit of grease in this spigot in the end of the prop shaft might be in order, although it doesn't rotate, if only to stop it from seizing solid with rust or something when we come to pull it out again, which is hopefully never. I'll take the load on this jack under the gearbox, and I'll take the gearbox rear cross member off for easier access to there. Well, those went on with a bit of waggling of the shaft here and a lot of bad language. So they're holding it there, not done up yet. I'll go and try the other end. Well, now that, after an epic battle, is on both ends and in the middle. Just have to do up all the nuts now. Just as well, the prop shaft only weighs 10 kilograms complete. Cross brace thingy. Little exhaust bracket thingy on the back of the gearbox. Just there. At some point I have, of course, bled the new clutch slave cylinder. Now the heat shield, first the small one up beside the gearbox at the front here, I think, and the big one from behind the gearbox through to the back axle. Now the front cross brace. And I'm doing it now so that when I put the exhaust on, the exhaust front flange can just rest on top of it, on top of the cross brace, while I'm trying to fit it. Now the exhaust, all 29 kilograms of it. This is going in on wheels. Seriously. Beats dragging it along the ground. There we are. Just have to lift it into place now. Probably just use a jack. So that's the exhaust. 4 bolts on the manifold flange at the front. A bracket on the rear of the gearbox. A rubber hanger just after the second little muffler in between the back wheels. And 2 exhaust clamp bolts right at the tail. And finally plug in the O2 sensor. That thing there plugs in up the side of the gearbox. Finally, I think that hole just there is probably it. The dipstick tube goes back in and bolts on there. That was a bit of a performance to get it to go past the O-ring in the dipstick hole. But I finally got it. Now I just do up that nut and put the dipstick back in. Connect up the battery. That previous illustration is wrong. Do not put this link on that way round with the bend at the gear lever end. It must go on that way round with the bend at the gearbox end. Otherwise it'll fit fine, it'll work fine until you finally raise the gearbox into place, when it will jam solid on the ring at the front end of the drive shaft. Guess how I know. This is the ring it jams on. It is possible by slacking off those two gearbox crossmember bolts under the heat shield, undoing those and lowering the whole thing about a ½ inch with the jack. It is possible then to reach up there and get the clips off using a long spanner screwdriver tapped up into there, and lever the link off. So to repeat, it goes on with the bend at the gearbox end. Like that. Not with the bend at the gear lever end like that. Whether I can get the clips back on without taking off a lot more stuff remains to be seen. So, that way up. Well, that worked. I now have gears. Yep. Would I change the clutch again this way using axle stands and floor jacks? Well, yes, if I had to. A hoist would make it much easier and quicker, but only if I had access also to a high-level gearbox jack, or someone else to help me lift the gearbox out and lift the exhaust off, because they are heavy.